In Kansas City, Missouri, on the afternoon of 2 January 1935, a man walked into the hotel president as Roland T. Owen and asked for a room on an upper-level floor. He also asked that it needed to be a room on the inside, overlooking the courtyard and not the street. He stated that he would only be staying for one night and that he had no luggage. Upon paying for the room and signing the register, he was given room 1046. The man was described as a tall, husky young man in his early 20s, with a cauliflower ear and a large scar on the side of his head. He was dressed well and wore a dark overcoat. He signed the register and stated that he hailed from Los Angeles. On the way to his room, Owen told the bellboy, Randolph Probst, that he had stayed at the nearby Muehlebach Hotel the previous night, but he was put off by the high price of $5 a night. When they reached room 1046, the bellboy opened the door and they went inside. Owen took a comb, brush, and toothpaste out of his coat pocket and placed them in the bathroom on the sink. Then the pair went back out into the hall and the bellboy locked the door. He gave Owen the key, after which the new guest left the hotel and the bellboy returned to his usual duties. Later that day, a cleaning lady went to clean room 1046, and when she opened the door, Owen was inside the room. She apologized and said that she didn't know that anyone would be inside. He allowed her in and said that she could go ahead and clean. While she did, she noticed that he had the shades drawn and left only one dim lamp on. He seemed worried about something or afraid. After she had been cleaning for a few minutes, he put his overcoat on and brushed his hair. He left the room and asked her to leave the room unlocked as he was expecting some friends in a little while. Around 4 p.m. the same cleaning lady returned to room 1046 with fresh towels. The door was still unlocked, and when she opened the door, she saw that the room was still eerily dim lit. He was lying on the bed, fully dressed, and she saw a note on the desk that read, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." She put the towels down and she left the room. The next we know of Owen's movements came at around 10:30 the next morning. The same cleaning lady came to clean his room. The door was locked, and she assumed that Owen was gone, since the door could only be locked from the outside. She opened the door, and when she entered, she was a bit unnerved to see him sitting silently in the same chair as he was the previous day, in the darkness, staring at nothing. The awkward moment was broken by the ringing of the room phone. Owen answered it, and she set about cleaning. After listening to the person on the other side for a moment, he said, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." After he hung up, he started asking the cleaner questions about the President Hotel, wanting to know whether it was residential and wanted to know whether she was responsible for cleaning the whole floor. He then repeated his complaint about the high rates of the Muehlebach Hotel. She finished cleaning the room, took the used towels, and left. That afternoon, she again went back to the room with fresh clean towels, and when she got there, from the outside of the door, she heard two men talking. She knocked, and a voice that wasn't that of the guest she spoke to earlier asked who it was. She explained why she was there, and that same voice responded gruffly that they didn't need any towels. She knew that there were no towels in the hotel room, but she shrugged to herself and left. Later that day, a lady by the name of Jean Owen, who was no relation to Roland, registered at the President Hotel. She was a native to Lee's Summit in Kansas. She had just finished a day's shopping in the city, and she felt unwell and decided not to drive home that night. She was given room 1048. Her boyfriend that was working at a florist in the city came to visit her at 9:20 p.m. and stayed for around 2 hours before leaving. She, unfortunately, did not have a peaceful night. She was continually bothered by the loud sounds of a male and female voices arguing and speaking loudly and profanely all night. The graveyard shift elevator operator at the hotel also noticed unusual activity that night. There was what sounded like a particularly noisy party in room 1055. Sometime after midnight, he took a woman to the 10th floor. She was looking for room 1026. He had seen her around the president numerous times. As he put it discreetly, she was a woman who frequents the hotel with different men in different rooms. And we all know what that means. A few minutes later, he was signaled to return to the 10th floor. The woman was concerned because the man who had arranged to meet her there was nowhere to be found. Being unable to help her, he went back downstairs, and she remained on the 10th floor. About half an hour later, the woman summoned him again to take her down to the lobby, as the man had still not shown up. About an hour later, she returned to the hotel again with a different man and asked for the elevator to take them to the 9th floor, which he did. Around 4 a.m., a call came in from the 9th floor, and it was the woman who left the hotel. 15 minutes later, a call again came in from the 9th floor, and it was the man who was with her. He said he was heading out for a walk because he couldn't sleep. This couple was never identified, and it is not known whether they had anything to do with Owen or room 1046. At around 11 p.m. that same night, a city worker named Robert Lane was driving on a downtown street when he saw a man running down the sidewalk. He was puzzled to see that on this winter's night, the stranger was wearing only an undershirt, pants, and shoes. The man waved Lane down, and when he stopped, he apologized, saying that he thought he was a taxi driver. The man then asked whether Lane could take him someplace where he could in fact get a cab. Lane agreed, commenting, "You look as if you've been in it bad." The man nodded and growled and said, "I'll kill that effer tomorrow." Which was when Lane noticed his passenger had a wound on his arm that he was cupping to stop the flowing blood. When they reached their destination, the man thanked Lane, exited the car, and honked the horn of a nearby cab, upon which its driver exited from a nearby restaurant, and Lane drove off. At 7 a.m. on the 4th of January, a new switchboard operator, Tella Ferguson, came on shift. She was preparing to make a requested wake-up call to room 1046 when she noticed a light indicating that the phone was off the hook. She sent Randolph Probst, the bellboy, to tell whoever was there to put the phone back on the hook, but when he got there, he found the door locked, with a "Do Not Disturb" sign. When he knocked after a moment, he heard a voice tell him to come in. When he tried the door, he found it was still locked. He knocked again, only to have the voice tell him, "Turn on the lights." After a couple more minutes of fruitless knocking, Probst finally yelled, "Put the phone back on the hook," and left, shaking his head at what he assumed was their crazy drunken guest. He went back and told the switchboard operator that the guest was probably drunk and to try again in an hour. An hour and a half later, the operator saw that the phone was still unhooked. She sent another bellboy up to deal with the problem. The bellboy Pike found 1046 still locked with the "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging on the door. He used a key that he had with him to open the door, showing that it had again been locked from the outside. In the darkness, he was able to make out that Owen was lying on the bed naked. The telephone stand had been knocked down, and the phone was on the floor, and he thought that Owen must have done that in a drunken stupor. The light coming in from the hallway showed some dark stains on the bedding, but he didn't investigate it further. He went ahead and put the telephone stand upright and replaced the phone on the hook. Like the other bellboy, he assumed their guest was merely drunk, and without bothering to check Owen's condition more closely, he left. Shortly before 11 a.m., another telephone operator had come on duty and noticed that a phone in 1046 was again off the hook. Once again, Probst, the first bellboy, was sent up to the room. he found the do not disturb sign still on the door. After his knocks got no response, he opened the door, as he had this time brought a key with him, and he walked inside and found something far worse than mere intoxication. Owen was still naked, but this time he was crouched on the floor about 2 feet away from the door, and he held his bloody head in his hands. When probes turned on the light, he saw more blood on the walls, in the bathroom, and on the bed. The frightened bellboy ran downstairs immediately for help. He returned with his assistant manager, but when they did try and open the door, they could only open it around 6 inches or around 15 centimeters, as Owen had in the interim fallen on the floor. Eventually, Owen managed to get up, and the 2 hotel employees were able to enter the room. He went and sat on the edge of the bathtub. The assistant manager called the police, who arrived quickly, and they were joined by a doctor from Kansas City General Hospital. The officers found that about 6 or 7 hours earlier, someone had done dreadful things to Roland Owen. He had been bound with cord around his neck, wrists, and ankles. His neck had further bruising, and this suggested that someone had been attempting to strangle him. He had been stabbed more than once in the chest above the heart, and one of these wounds had punctured his lung. Blows to his head had left him with a skull fracture on the right side. In addition to the blood that probes had seen, there was some additional spatter on the ceiling. Blood was basically everywhere. The small hotel room had looked like it had been turned into a torture chamber. When questioned about who did this to him, he said, "No one." He said he had fell and he hit his head against the bathtub. The doctor asked him whether he had tried to hurt himself. He also answered no, and soon after fell unconscious. While Owen was being rushed to the hospital, he fell into a deep coma and sadly died shortly after midnight on January the 5th. Doctors performed an autopsy on him and determined that he had died from his wounds. The bloodstains in the room had also been examined, and since much of it had dried by the time that they had arrived, it was estimated that the wounds had been inflicted between 4 and 5 a.m. that day. Detectives searched room 1046, and they took note of what they did find, but found it more of a mystery when they started to record what they did not find. There was not a single stitch of clothing anywhere in 1046. The room's standard soap, shampoo, and towels were also gone. All they found was a label from a necktie, an unsmoked cigarette, 4 bloody fingerprints on a lampshade that were small enough to seem to be those of a woman, and a hairpin. There was also no sign of the cords, which must have been used to bind Owen, and there were no knives or any other weapon that could have stabbed him. One of the room's 2 glasses was found in the sink, missing a piece, and the other was still on the shelf. A hotel employee reported that several hours before he was found, he had seen a man and a woman leave the president hurriedly. There was no doubt that, in the words of one of the detectives, someone else was mixed up in this. Meanwhile, investigators were quickly realizing that this was no ordinary murder when Los Angeles police found that they had no record of anyone named Roland T. Owen, which led to the assumption that the victim had checked in using a pseudonym. The police sought help through the press. The Kansas City and Los Angeles evening newspapers carried the story on their front pages, and the next day they confirmed that the case was definitely considered a homicide. This unknown man, still known as Roland T. Owens' body, was taken to a funeral home where it was publicly displayed in the hope that someone would recognize him. Among the visitors viewing his body was Robert Lane, the man who drove the suspicious man in his car to a cab, and he identified the dead man as the man that he drove. The lead investigator was not so sure that it was in fact him that he drove, since none of the hotel staff had reported seeing him leave or return during the night of January 3 to 4. Police were able to establish one sighting of him outside the hotel a report that he had been seen with 2 women at several liquor places or bars on 12th Street, as several bartenders testified seeing a man matching Owen's description in the company of 2 women. An anonymous woman phoned police the night of Owen's death, saying that she thought that he lived in Clinton, Missouri, and that was also proven to not be the case. Police also discovered that the night before Owen registered at the President's Hotel, a man matching his description had briefly stayed at the Muhlebach, given his name as Eugene K. Scott of Los Angeles. Unsurprisingly, no trace of anyone by that name could be found either. Earlier, Owen/Scott had stayed at yet another Kansas City hotel, the St. Regis, in the company of a man who was never identified. They were having no more luck with tracing this Don person that the unknown victim had talked to during his stay at the President, and might have also been the man who stayed with him at the other hotel. Was this also the man who was there with the sex worker in the President? Was he the strange voice who had told the maid not to bother bringing in the fresh towels? Was Don the man that Owen had told Lane he wanted to kill? Was Don the man who had been at the St. Regis with him? All excellent questions, but they were never fated to be answered. Wire services began picking up the story, and it ran in newspapers and on radio around the country, with requests to send photographs to Kansas City. More leads on the man's identity came in as a result, and the KCPD had to devote considerable time to corresponding with police all over the country via mail and telegram to follow up on leads. Eventually they were able to eliminate many. The mystery seemed solved when a man identified the body as his cousin. But then, when the man's sister came to view the body, she confirmed that the cousin had in fact died 5 years earlier, although the resemblance between the two had been very strong. A week into the investigation, Tony Bernardi, a wrestling promoter from Little Rock, Arkansas, said that after viewing the body, that the man had approached him around the beginning of December 1934 and wanted to participate in some wrestling matches, and identified himself as Cecil Warner. Bernardi had referred him to another promoter in Omaha, Nebraska, but that promoter did not recognize the victim and said that he had never visited him. Within a few days, 2 new homicides in the city drew detectives' attention away from the case, even as more were assigned to the homicide squad. Leads were still followed, but less vigorously than they had been in the week after the case had first started. And none of these yielded any significant information. Newspaper coverage likewise dwindled down. While all of the information received established that Roland Owen was a very peculiar man, none of it was the slightest help in discovering his real identity, let alone the name of his killer. The woman's hairpin found in his room, plus the angry male and female voices Gene Owen had heard, led to talk that the murder stemmed from a love triangle, but that theory remained mere speculation. Police were becoming resigned to writing off his death as one of an unsolved mystery. And by the beginning of March, preparations were made to bury the unknown victim in an unmarked grave. It was announced in the newspaper that John Doe, aka Roland T. Owen, would be buried in the city's Potter's Field, and soon after, the head of the funeral home in charge of the body received an anonymous phone call. The man, on the other side, asked that the burial be delayed so they could send the funeral home the money for a grave and service at Memorial Park Cemetery in Kansas City. The funeral director warned the caller that he would have to tell the police about the call. The caller said he knew and that it did not bother him. He said he wanted the man to be buried close to his sister, as Owen was the dead man's real name, and that he had been engaged to the caller's sister. The funeral director said that the mysterious benefactor told him that Owen had gotten into a jam when he cheated on his sister with another woman, and then he hung up the phone. The service was postponed as per the anonymous caller's request, and on March 23rd, the funeral home received a delivery envelope, the address carefully lettered using a ruler, with $25 wrapped in newspaper. It was enough to cover all expenses. The sender was unknown, but Owen was finally buried in Memorial Park Cemetery. No one attended the funeral other than a handful of detectives. More money was sent with equal mysteriousness to a local florist to pay for a bouquet of roses for the grave. It was accompanied by a card to be placed with the flowers. It read, "Love forever, Louise." Other detectives posing as gravediggers staked out the grave for the next several days, but no one came to visit. Images of the still unknown dead man continued to be circulated nationwide in the hope of someone identifying him. The Owen case drifted into obscurity until late 1936, when a woman named Eleanor Ogletree learned of an account of the murder given in the magazine American Weekly. She thought the description of the given Owen matched that of her missing brother, Artemis Ogletree. The Ogletrees had not seen him since he left his home in Birmingham, Alabama, in April 1934 to quote-unquote see the country. Ruby, his mother, contacted the KCPD and told them that the unknown man was, in fact, her son Artemis Ogletree, who was born in Florida in 1915. She was able to provide enough information about the previously unknown victim, including a description of his head scar, which she explained was the result of a childhood accident in which some hot grease had spilled there and the hair had never grown back. Artemis was one of 3 children and was only 17 years old when he was murdered. So the unknown dead man had finally been identified, but more questions were raised when Ruby told the detectives that the last she heard from him was when 3 brief typewritten letters were sent to her. The first of these letters arrived in the spring of 1935, several months after Artemis had actually died. Mrs. Ogletree later said she was suspicious of these letters from the start, as her son did not know how to type, and the way he spoke and the language he used in those letters was not the same as the previous handwritten note that she had received. The first 2 letters were sent from Chicago, and the last letter received said he was sailing for Europe and was sent from New York. Several months after the last letter was received, she received a phone call from a man from Memphis, Tennessee, who said that Artemis had saved his life in a fight in Egypt and that his son was now married to a wealthy Cairo woman and living there. He also said that Artemis was unable to write because he had lost one of his thumbs in the fight where he had saved the caller. Ruby talked with the man for half an hour or so. She recalled that he spoke wildly and irrationally, but seemed to have first-hand knowledge of Artemis. If Artemis had, at some point before his death, gone to Egypt or anywhere else overseas, he had not done so under his own name. No steamship company at the time had any record that he traveled with them. The consular section of the US Embassy in Cairo was also unable to find any evidence that he had been there. So, what was this caller going on about? In 1937, the New York City police arrested a man named Joseph Martin on a murder charge after he had killed a man he shared a room with and put the body in a trunk to be shipped to Memphis. Among the several aliases he was found to have used was Donald Kelso. According to a story about the case in the New Yorker, the KCPD had matched samples of his handwriting to that in the letters written to Ruby Ogletree. No charges were filed against the man for the Ogletree case, and the KCPD kept the case open. The files show that different detectives reviewed the case every few years through the 1950s. Each time they noted that they would keep the case open and follow up, but no new evidence was uncovered, and gradually the case went cold. In 2003 or 2004, John Horner, a local historian at the Kansas City Public Library, fielded a call from someone out of state who said that they had been helping to inventory the belongings of an elderly person who had recently died. Among them was a shoebox, which turned out to be filled with newspaper clippings related to the case, as well as, according to them, one item mentioned in the newspaper stories. The caller identified neither themselves nor the item, and no follow-up was made. Justice for Artemis's brutal death has remained hopelessly elusive. This is one of those irritating, unsolved murders that is nothing but a bunch of questions left in a hopelessly tangled mess. Why was Artemis Ogletree using multiple false names, checking into different hotels? What was he doing in Kansas City? Who was Don? Who killed him? Why did they kill him? Who sent the money to pay for Ogletree's funeral? Who was Louise? Who really wrote those letters to Ruby Ogletree? What was the story about Cairo? What happened in room 1046? It's almost certain we will never know what really happened to Artemis Ogletree, but I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and theories on the case. So let me tell you where my crazy ass went when I first read this story. I immediately thought, yep, no, he's a vampire, Cause like, if you think he didn't go out during the day, he had the shades drawn, someone tried to stab him above the heart, how did the other people get into the room if no one saw them? It's all very strange. So yeah, let me know your thoughts and opinions. They don't have to be supernatural like mine. Thanks again for clicking on this video if you have gotten this far. I really do appreciate each and every one of your support so very much. Please remember to like and subscribe if you've not done so already. Until next time, stay safe out there. Bye.